It's good to see everybody here this morning. If you have your Bible with you, go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 13, the chapter, what I like to call the chapter of the parables. And the scripture reading this morning is going to come from verses 44 and 45. And it says there, "Of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had, and he bought it." That's Matthew chapter 13, verses 44 and 45. Isn't it interesting that even 2,000 years ago, that people had their minds set on treasure? Just think about some of the greatest movies that have ever been made. First one that really comes to me is all of the ones, National Treasure with Nicolas Cage. National Treasure 1, National Treasure 2, indicating something what? That the story is going to involve something of great value. Or what about the Indiana Jones movies? And the Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail and something of great value that, by the way, he's a really bad archaeologist. I just want to say that. And so we have all of these movies that have been made that involve this idea of finding something of great value, of great treasure, because they appeal to everyone. Now, we might not necessarily associate things of great value with the specific word treasure, but we treat those things as if they are treasure. So what are some of the things that we value as treasure? Well, for some of us, it might be the books that we collect, or the books that we read. See, this right here is C.S. Lewis's complete signature classics, because I'm a C.S. Lewis nut. I didn't want all of the books to take up space, so I said, just get me the anthology, right? Christmas gift, right? So for some of us, it's books and the things that we might collect. My dad, a couple of years ago, and this recording, so Dad, this for you, I love you, it's okay. A couple of years ago, I went home, and to my surprise, in the family room, there were lunch boxes. Yes, 10 lunch boxes. Some of y'all remember those, right? And I'm not just talking about 2 or 3. I'm not even talking about 10. I'm talking, there had to be at least 50 to 60 10 lunch boxes laid out on the floor. And I said, "Mom, what is going on here? What is wrong with Dad?" And she said, "Darling, bless his heart. Because this is his new collection thing." And so it's some of the things that we collect. For some of us, it might even be some of the accomplishments that we have. This right here is the citation for me becoming a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I still have that because I find it to be very valuable. I wouldn't trade this for the world, because when Nora and Ren grow up, and however other many kids we're going to have, I don't know, bless her heart, I want them to know about this, about some of the things that their dad did, some of the things that their dad saw. And so for some of us, the treasure that we hold deepest and in most regard are the accomplishments that we have, but also the accomplishments that we want to have later down the line. Maybe that's in our job profession. And then for some of us, some of the things that we value as great treasure is just silly stuff like this. It was a gift. I love it. And some of y'all are looking at me like I'm crazy. That's because I am, okay? Because I am crazy. And so for some of us, it's the teams that we root for. It's the teams that we will dedicate, crazy amounts of time to. Guilty as charged. I get it, right? I'm working on it, okay? And so there will be people who spend massive amounts of money to support their team or to go see their team play. I was just looking at it the other day. I wanted to get a gift sometime this year for my brother, and he's a huge Notre Dame fan, and try and get a Notre Dame ticket. The cheapest Notre Dame ticket I could find on StubHub was over $300, and that was for the nosebleeds at South Bend, Indiana. If you want to buy a Duke Carolina ticket that's at Cameron Indoor, get ready to pay $9,000. Now, why would anybody set that price for Duke Carolina game? Because they know there's some sucker or suckers out there that'll pay it. And to be honest, could if I would, or would if I could, right? And so we all have these things that we value, that we treasure, that we say, you know what, I'd be willing to die for that. Some of you right now might be wearing your favorite shirt, or you walked in with your favorite dress, or you have your favorite outfit that you wear, right? And your spouse comes to you 20 years after you bought it and say, honey, it's time to give that up. That looks a little holy. You know what I mean by that? Some holy socks. Not that there's anything special about that. Not that they've, been, consecrated in the temple. But they look like a piece of Swiss cheese. Right? And you won't give it up. Why? Because those are my favorite pair of socks. We would die for some socks. We'll die for some shirts. We'll die for accomplishments. We'll die for sports teams, right? We'll die for the things that we collect. And know what's the funny thing about that? We live in a society that obviously propagates that. But what's so interesting about that is we're not content with any of it. For the most part. I mean, we always say, or people usually say, if I just had enough of X, I would be okay. Most of the time it's, well, if I just could have that one promotion, or if I just had this amount of money, or if I just had, this A, B, C, or D, I'd be content. And then when they get it, what happens? They're not content. It's always the next letter. I mean, at some point, here's the thing about culture, and this is just us as people, enough, a large majority of the time, is never enough. And so we become restless. And so we work ourselves into this cycle of saying, I have to have all of this stuff in order to be happy, in order to experience joy, in order to feel accomplished, in order to be accepted. And so there are many people in the world. Isn't it interesting that we are the richest nation in the country, but the depression rate and the suicide rate is the highest in the world? Because there's so many people out there that can't find this thing called being content. There are so many people in the world that can't find this thing called ultimate happiness or ultimate joy. And maybe you're that person here this morning. I don't know. But I bet you know somebody that's like that. I bet you know somebody that loses sleep over the fact that they don't have enough, but they say they treasure all they have. What if it were different? What if we found something that was enough? That enough could finally be enough because we've had or found all that we really actually need. See, that was the same problem in Jesus' day. Jesus is talking to a group of people in Matthew chapter 13, verses 44 through 45, who simply want enough to be enough. And they associate that. Some of them associate that with the status of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Man, if I could just be that religious, or if I could just hold that spot, that'd be great. A majority of the people during this time looked at the Roman Empire and said, man, if Israel could just get back to that level of military might, of political influence, of economic success, if we could just get back to the days of David, man, that would be enough. That would be joy. That would be happiness. That's what would make us content. And know what the great thing about Jesus is that's not what Jesus says. And so Jesus is trying to explain to them through parables, common truisms, built around a spiritual point. That's what that is. And through these parables, he talks to them about what his kingdom is like. And as we know from his conversation with Pilate, Jesus' kingdom is radically different than the kingdoms of the world. And so in explaining to them about the kingdom, he uses this idea, he hones in on this thing called treasure, this thing called valuable, maybe even, put in there riches, so to speak. And what Jesus is going to offer these people in these two short phrases, and what he's going to offer you, and what he's going to offer me this morning is something that has the potential to change your life, to change the way in which you look at life, to change the way in which you look at some of the things that you possess, some of the accomplishments that you wish you had, and some of the people maybe that are even in your life. Not because of what you can gain physically, but what Jesus offers spiritually. See, the kingdom is enough because of the King. The kingdom is enough because of the King. And so this is what he says in verse 44. The kingdom of heaven. There's that word, there's that phrase that shows up repeatedly in Matthew chapter 13 that repeats itself in the book of Matthew. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure. Notice that. I hope we grasp that this morning, that of all the things that we value and all of the things that we place value on, what Jesus does in his supremacy as the King notes to everybody that there is this thing called his kingdom, and it is valuable. That it does carry some weight, that it does impact the world, and that it does have value in the lives of not just the people in Matthew chapter 13, but it should, and it can, and it will have value in your life and my life. He notes it as a treasure. Sometimes we view the kingdom as a graveyard. Sometimes it's really easy to look out into the way the world is and the way that society is and say, you know what? There's just no way that this kingdom, this church thing, this organization, this organism called the church can really make an impact on culture. Well, Jesus says it's a treasure. Jesus says that it has great value. And if it has great value, then what is the response for the people who find it? And that's what he notes going down the line here. He says, it's like a treasure hidden in a field which a man found, and then he covered it up. And so this man finds this treasure just out there in the field. And he sees it and he covers it up because he protects the kingdom, because he doesn't want anybody to come along and steal it from him. And that's the same thing with the kingdom now. I hope that you place so much value on the kingdom of Jesus Christ that you will do anything to protect it so that you and your family can experience the weight, the glory, the mercy, the compassion, and the value of what it means to be a part of the kingdom. See, oftentimes we place more value on the social clubs we're a part of, rather than placing the value necessary being a part of the kingdom. And so he hides this so nobody will steal it from him. And then notice what he does. Then in his what? In his sadness. In his, I'm going to make up a word here, right? Preachers are allowed to make up words, right? Okay, there you go, check. All right. In his, it doesn't say in his Eeyoreness, right? It doesn't say in his, oh brother. right? It says in his joy, in his being exceedingly happy on the basis of what he has now come into possession of. He's come into possession of what? This treasure. He's come into possession of what? This kingdom. He is now a part of something that causes great joy. And he goes and notice what he does. He sells half his stuff. Oh, wait. He sells a third of his stuff. He sells a tenth of his stuff. It says there that he sells everything and then buys the field because of what's in the field. And this is just somebody who just stumbled along and found it. And in the great joy that they have, they say, you know what? This is so valuable. This thing right here is so valuable that I am willing to take everything that I have, everything that I have subjectively placed my value on, and I will give all of that up so that I might own and be a part of this kingdom to have this treasure. See, this person who stumbles across this treasure and sells everything, it's not like he's content with just saying, well, I want to have half of my stuff and then I want to have all of the kingdom. And sometimes that's the way in which we try and work within God's kingdom. Say, well, I want to have all of what God offers, but I also want to have everything that I want and the world offers. And Jesus' teaching in this parable is you can't experience the full weight of the joy of the kingdom if you're still stuck and trapped in all of the stuff. Jesus would later go on to say, or in another part in the Gospels would go on to say that if you're going to be a part of the kingdom, you can't serve both God and stuff. And so Jesus comes back around in the second section in verse 45, and he says again. So if you didn't get the first one in verse 44, let me come back to you in verse 45 and come at this from another angle. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant, someone who goes and he goes out and he sells, he barters, he trades because he seeks things that are valuable. A merchant in search of what? Fine pearls. So this merchant obviously knows what's valuable in the sight of other people. He obviously has a gauge of what's valuable in his own sight. It's not that he's like the person that just simply stumbles across the treasure. He knows what really good treasure looks like. He understands that. He's experienced in that because that's the way in which he lives his life. That if he could just have another valuable pearl, if he could just have another valuable item, then maybe it would be enough. And in verse 46 it says, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all he had and he bought it. See, that just doesn't make really good economic sense in the first century. Because if you're a dealer in pearls, why in the world would you sell everything that you've gained so that you can possess one pearl of great value that you'll never sell? He's put himself in the hole. He's put himself in the red. He's no longer has the opportunity to sell all this stuff to put himself in the black. I mean, his business is about to fold. So why in the world would he say it's worth it? Maybe it's because he's tried looking at all of the other pearls that seem to be valuable, but don't compare to this one. And what Jesus is saying is that he, as the king of the kingdom, is that one pearl that by comparison to all the other pearls that this gentleman has come across is exceedingly valuable, not because it brings monetary gain, but because that kingdom brings an insurmountable joy and peace that can only be found in him, but can only be gained when we are willing to give up everything. How much is that? Everything. And I want you to flip over real quick to Philippians chapter 3, because Paul, I really do believe that Paul is drawing on this analogy. Because notice what Paul says in Philippians chapter 3, beginning in verse 4. Though I myself have reasons for confidence in the flesh also, if anyone else thinks he has reasons for confidence in the flesh, I even more. And so what Paul is saying is, if we want to take and say who's the most valuable, if we want to take and say who's the most important, or if we want to say who's got the most accomplishments under their belt, which equals holiness, Paul says, I've got more than everybody. And he says in verse 4, or in verse 5, circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, God's chosen, of the tribe of Benjamin, honorable tribe, a Hebrew of Hebrews. If anybody's a Hebrew, if anybody's a Jew, it's me. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. How much did Paul love and value being a Jew, value being a Pharisee, value his lineage, value all of the things that came with being a Jew? So much to the point that he persecuted God's own people. A persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. And so what he's saying is, if someone wanted to bring a charge against Paul about his ability to follow the law, they couldn't bring a charge against him. He says, I would be blameless. But notice what Paul does, and notice what Paul says. In light of finding that treasure, in light of having access to that pearl, in light of being part of the kingdom, in light of coming in contact with the King of Kings. But whatever I have gained, I count it as loss. Now, why would you say that, Paul? That's a pretty good lineage. That's a pretty good sheet right there. I mean, if you're putting in a resume, hire the guy. Because of the surpassing, not equal to, but the surpassing, the exceedingly exponential greatness of knowing Christ. And see, there are so many distractions in your life, there's so many distractions in my life, that if we're not careful, we'll allow those distractions to get in the way of our relationship with Jesus. And it's cliche, and we've heard it before, but those distractions will keep us from diving into God's Word outside of Wednesday and Sunday. Those distractions will keep us from sitting down as a family individually and talking through some of the spiritual things that are going on in our lives, those that are good, those that are bad, and those that we might need help with in the future or right now. Those distractions will allow us to look at the culture and view the culture and the things in the culture as more valuable than that one pearl. They'll be more valuable than being a part of that kingdom. See, what Satan wants you and I to do is be so distracted on the things that the world offers that we can't see the spiritual forest through the trees and what Jesus offers. And Paul says that what Jesus offers is a surpassing joy and knowledge of Jesus Christ. And the thing about Jesus is he's not the $1 million bonus for your job. He's not hitting the Powerball. He's not being the most popular at school. He's not being the best at everything that you do. He's not being the All-American. He's not the collection. He's not the accomplishment. He's not the achievement. He's not all of those things. He's not the multitude. He's the one pearl. And Paul says, for his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish. Literally, what Paul says there with the word rubbish is human waste. He says, all these things that I have, in relation, in comparison to Jesus Christ, it's like human waste. In order that I might gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Jesus Christ from God, that depends on faith, that I might know him. See, if I want to know Jesus, if I want to see the value in the pearl, if I want to see the value in the treasure, then there are certain things in my life, and maybe it's some work relationships, maybe it's some people at school, maybe it's some possessions that I have, maybe it's the attitude that I possess. There are certain things in my life that I have to give up so that I might know him. And what Paul promises and what Jesus says in the parable of the treasure and the pearl is that if I give those things up, I find the one thing that I've been looking for my entire life, the point in which I can say that the kingdom is enough. Because of the King. And maybe one of the reasons that we might not be experiencing that this morning is because we don't look enough to the pearl, we don't look enough to the treasure, but we're more focused on looking like the culture than we are looking like the kingdom and the King. So, I have to admit, this right here is a really neat thing to have. Because there's a section of the population, a large majority, that don't have this. And will never have it. And people, most of the time, when I say something about being a sergeant in the Marine Corps, they say, well, thank you for your service, that's awesome. And I appreciate that. But you know what this ultimately is in light of the pearl? You know what this ultimately is in light of the treasure? You know what this ultimately is in light of what Paul said in Philippians chapter 3, verses 8 and following? This is nothing more than a binder and 2 sheets of paper. You know what this is? As great as a gift that it is, and as awesome and as much as I love this right here. You know what this ultimately is? Stones on a board is what that is. Now I'm not going to throw it on the ground. And even this here, as much as I love this collection, as much knowledge and as much insight as this thing provides, and as much joy as it may bring to me, you know what this ultimately is? Ultimately, this is really good writing by a guy who's passed on, by a guy who's not living. But you know what Jesus is? In light of the accomplishments, in light of the collections, in light of the stones that are on boards, in light of the checks that are deposited. You know what Jesus is in light of all those things? Everything. He's enough. The kingdom is enough because of the King. And you know what I appreciate about this group of people that are here this morning? Is because time and time again, you display that the kingdom is enough because of the King. And in preparing for this lesson, I thought back to some of the things that I've seen in you. I can remember a time in which Miss Jean Bagwell was sick, and she believed that the kingdom was enough because of the King. And that there were people in this very room that tended to her needs, that tended to her family, because they weren't distracted by all the things that were going on in their life. They weren't distracted by everything that was going on in the culture. They didn't do it so that they could get a pat on the back. They did it because the kingdom was enough because of the King. I think about Don and Peggy Rowland, who right now, for all that they have and all that they own and all that they are, would give everything to be here with us this morning because they believe that the kingdom is enough because of the King. And there are a multitude of people here who right now are dealing with their own health issues, and they're here because the kingdom is enough because of the King. There are a multitude of you here who have talked multiple times and have experienced things in your family and have experienced things at work and have experienced things at school, but you're here because you believe that the kingdom is enough because of the King. And I just want to tell you that gives everybody that knows you hope. That gives me hope. That helps me grow. And that should help all of us and drive all of us to assess whether or not we're still there. Whether or not we still view that pearl as valuable. Whether or not the kingdom is enough because of the King. Because the last thing that I want us to do, individually and collectively, is get to a point where even though that pearl seems really shiny, or even though that treasure is still sitting there, it doesn't get old because it's lost value. It gets old because we've lost interest. See, Jesus sees great value in us because even before the foundation of the earth, he was interested in us and valued all of us. And that's the way we should approach the kingdom. So let me ask a couple of questions before we wrap up this morning. When you survey your life right now, and when you look at the bank statement, when you look at your computer, when you look at the time that you spend working, and you compare that to the time that you spend working in the vineyard of the Lord, and you compare that to the time that you spend with the King in his kingdom, what do you value? Because where you spend your time, and where you spend your money, and where you spend your meditation, and where you spend your study, that's good poetry right there, shows us what we think of the kingdom and what we think of the King. See, he's already displayed what he thinks of you and I. For when we were weak, when we were without hope, when we were sinners, condemned to hell, John chapter 1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Verse 14 says that the Word became flesh. In the beginning he came, and on the cross he said, it is finished. And maybe this morning, you've lost interest in the pearl. Maybe this morning, you've lost interest in the treasure. And maybe this morning, you no longer have a desire to serve the King. Would you lay aside for 1 week, would you lay aside all the burdens and the worries about money, about the job, about social status, and just meditate on chapter 13? And maybe reassess what Jesus is saying about what brings true value to life. And I believe if you do that, there are a couple of things that are going to happen. Number one, you're going to see that true joy and true happiness and complete joy and complete happiness can't be found in the things that are physical, but can only be accessed through things that are spiritual. And number two, I think what will happen is as you evaluate that and as you look at that, you'll see the value of the kingdom, you'll see the value of the King, and it will drive you to ask the question, how do I change? Which should drive you to a Christian so that you can have that time to study, to meditate the Word of God. And for those of us that are Christians, some of the things that we might need to do again is, let me ask you a question. When was the last time you had a family devotional in your house? When was the last time you started your day and ended your day in prayer? When was the last time you went out into the world and sought to make a disciple? Those are indicators. They don't have to be final. Because when we do those things, we meditate, and we look at the value of the pearl and the value of the treasure, this is the one thing that we arrive at. That the kingdom is enough because of the King. If there's any way that we can help you this morning, please let that be known as we stand and as we sing.